Chapter 2. When they first went to Pearly Days, Miss Pearl told them to go in the kitchen and cook what they knew how to cook. Helen was so happy when she saw all the chickens. She fried up a couple of chickens and made her mama's homemade biscuits and gravy. Helena found the pork and some half-rotten bananas, so she fried a heap of meat pies and baked a few pans of banana nut bread. Miss Pearl tasted the food. "Who taught y'all to cook like this?" she asked. Mama," Helena said. Miss Pearl looked at them, smiled, and said, "Your mama done a good thing." "Thank you, ma'am," Helena said. After that, Miss Pearl and Miss Lucy showed them how to cook to order. Folks from all around would come to eat Miss Peach's smothered rabbit, Helen's fried chicken and biscuits, and Helena's meat pies. Teddy was with the men folk running numbers and helping out at Pearly Days. Miss Pearl gave them money, food, and their own apartment above Pearly Days to live. And Helen, Helena, and Teddy were all together, just like a family. Helena took a strong liking to Miss Pearl, and she did whatever Miss Pearl asked her to do with no back talk. Sometimes Helena would talk trash with the men folk, and Miss Pearl would laugh hard and loud. It was a happy time and a fresh start, like after a storm when the sun comes out and dries up all the rain. Everything was good for once. Chicago was big and cold. At night, you can hear the wind whistling through the city. The men called it the Hawk, on account it sounded like a winged predator that flew across the sky. Helen didn't mind the cold or the whistling wind, because to her, it beat the hell out of working the fields in the scolding heat until you pass out. Helen noticed the people were different too. They talked different, and they laughed more. And the men folks seemed to be more sure of who they were. And they didn't act like slaves. They acted like men. After some years had passed, Miss Pearl and Miss Lucy started taking Helen and Helena to the game house where the white gangsters hung out. It was the biggest house Helen and Helena had ever seen. On the inside, it was beautiful with shiny floors and beautiful rugs that covered it. Inside the parlor hung what Miss Pearl said were dresses for the windows called drapes. All the windows was covered with beautiful drapes, and down the stairs was a room filled with tables and chairs, and there were men and women playing a game called cards. At 3 tables, they were playing a card game called Tunk. At 3 other tables, they were playing a card game called Bid Whiz. And at the last 3 tables, they was playing a card game called Deuces. In the next room was a small kitchen where they set up all the food they bought from Pearly Days. They had meat pies, fried chicken and biscuits, boiled eggs, and peach cobbler. Miss Pearl and Helena stayed in the kitchen to finish setting up, while Miss Lucy and Helen went to run the tables. Miss Lucy liked how fast the twins could count and taught them the different card games weeks before they took them to the game house, so the girls knew the rules of the games. What they didn't know was how fast the games was played. Deuces was the fastest game, and Tunk was the slowest game. But in every game played, the house always got paid. Before the night was over, Helen was running the tables as good as Miss Lucy. Well, maybe not as good, but she was close. Meanwhile, Miss Pearl taught Helena how to sell the food. Helena was slinging the meat pies like a drug and didn't let nobody get nothing for free. Helena talked trash to everybody, even the gangsters. They really liked Helena, especially a young white Italian gangster named Marco, the nephew of big-time gangster Mr. Luigi Petrillo, and Mr. Luigi ran Chicago. They were originally from New York City, But before Mr. Luigi's grandfather died, he sent for Mr. Luigi to take over the family business. After a few years passed, Mr. Luigi's brother-in-law was killed in New York, and Mr. Luigi sent for his sister Stella and her little boy Marco to come live with him in Chicago. Marco was around 3 years old at the time. Mr. Luigi was a widower and didn't have any children, so he raised Marco as his own. After a few years, his sister Stella got homesick for New York and wanted to move back. Mr. Luigi bought her a nice home in New York and made sure she would be protected and well taken care of, but would not let her take Marco away from him. Stella felt that Marco needed a man in his life and promised Marco she would visit on every birthday and during the holidays, and then she left Marco with Mr. Luigi. Marco had a baby face, probably because he was only 16 years old at the time they met. Helen and Helena was 13 years old, but looked older. Miss Pearl called their hips bow hips because they were so rounded. And they had perky breasts like they mama had, and they booties jiggled when they walked. But what made them stop traffic was their legs. They had the most shapely legs Chicago had ever seen. The twins with the gams was what they called them. With the tips from running the card games, on top of the money they earned from working their Pearly days, Helen and Helena started getting their hair pressed and curled, and they bought beautiful dresses, shoes, and pantyhose with the seam running down the back. They was cutie pies, and they knew it. Marco wanted Helena bad. He always tipped her big and asked her out. She always took the money, then said no to going out with him. But this only made Marco want her more. He started bringing Helena flowers and candy and began having his family tobacco guy make a special blend of snuff just for her. As always, she would take the flowers and candy, and she really liked the special made snuff, but turned him down just the same. A couple years had passed by, and one day Marco saw the twins go into a dress shop and followed them inside. He then went on to buy Helena 11 new dresses, each with pantyhose and shoes to match. There was no way Helena was turning it down, so she accepted the wardrobe and said yes to dinner. At the apartment, Helen dropped a bowl on the floor and Helena jumped. "You don't have to go with him if you don't want to, sissy," Helen said. Helena smiled. "I know I'm a bit jumpy, but it's only because I like him." "With all the things he bought you, I bet you do," Helen replied. "I've always liked him, Helen, ever since the day we met." Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Ever since you first saw him? But you said nothing about liking him to me." Helena walked over to Helen and sat in the chair next to her. "I felt guilty for liking a white man, or white monster, as you always say. And I ain't saying you wrong. Lord knows it was white monsters who killed Mama." Helen looked in her sissy's light brown eyes and saw the truth in every word she said. And although Helen would always see the white man as monsters, she just couldn't rob her sissy of being on a path that could turn out to be a sweet adventure. So she said what she thought Helena needed to hear. "I don't think Marco is a white monster, but he's still a white man, and you have to be careful not to let him turn you into his bed wench. If he really likes you the way he say he do, then you make sure his words and his actions match, because you are much more than just a pretty young gal, much more." Then she hugged her sissy with all the compassion she had inside. "And you have nothing to feel guilty about, ever," she said. Tears filled Helena's eyes as she looked at her big sister. She smiled and said, "Thank you, Helen. I love you." Then Marco knocked on the door. "He's here," Helena said. Helen laughed. Calm down and give yourself a once-over. I'll step out and stall them for you. Wait, how do I look? Helena asked while posing with her hand on her hip. Helen laughed and said, You look like me. Now let me get the door. Okay, tell him I'll be right out, Helena said. Helen opened the door and there stood Marco, looking as handsome as ever, wearing his double-breasted suit and brim hat to match. He was carrying 24 roses, a dozen in each hand. Helen stepped out and closed the door behind her. She couldn't help but chuckle at the overkill of flowers. The roses are a nice touch, but don't you think 2 bunches is a bit much? Marco smiled nervously. One of the bouquets are for you, Helen. Helen sarcastically pointed to herself. For me? Why? Because I know how protective you are of your sister. And I know all you had to do was tell her not to go out with me, and she wouldn't. But instead, you allowed it. And for that, I thank you, he said. I have my doubts, but my doubts are less about you and more about my sissy. Do you know or even care about all the hate she will face after she's seen with you? She asked. My uncle just asked me the same thing, and I would tell you what I told him. I will make sure no harm ever comes to Helena. And I know that people will hate both of us for being together, but it won't change the way I look at her, and it won't change how I feel about her, he said. And how do you feel about her? She asked. Marco put his head down and said, I love her. Helen was shocked. Marco, a white boy, just professed his love for Helena, a colored girl. Men have been killed for much less. But you had to hang your head low before you said you love her. Looks like shame to me, and there is no shame in love, Helen said. Marco raised his head and looked at Helen with the fire in his eyes. I didn't hang my head low, Helen. I looked down at my feet to humble myself enough to stand here and beg you to trust me with your sister. And believe me when I say begging is something I never do. He then quickly calmed himself and spoke in a more gentle manner. All I'm asking is a chance to show how happy I can make your sissy. Thinking of the talk she had with her sissy, Helen reached out to accept the flowers. I guess everybody deserves one chance, she said. Marco gave her the roses. Thanks, Helen. You're welcome. And Marco, nobody calls her sissy except me. Marco smiled and said, I understand. Marco went all out. He picked Helena up in his Uncle Luigi's brand new buzz wagon. Helena was so excited. She had seen a few parked in the back of the game house while their owners were playing poker for high stakes, but never thought she would ever ride in one. When they drove off, Helena felt the wind on her face and smiled. I wasn't expecting this, she said. What were you expecting? Marco asked while concentrating on the road. A horse-drawn carriage, maybe, but this is wild. It's the best next thing to flying, she replied. Flying? He asked. Yes, like a bird, she said. Marco smiled. Oh, I see. Marco pulled up to a beautiful yellow brick duplex apartment building. And when Helena walked inside, she smelled delicious aromas coming from the kitchen. There was a bedroom, a kitchen, dining room, parlor, washroom, and a smaller room Marco used as his office. While Helena was taking her own private tour of the place, Marco was busy fussing around in the kitchen. Helena heard a woman's voice, so she walked to the kitchen to see who was there. Helena, this is Sophie. She was my nanny, but now she's more like an aunt who helped raise me after my mother moved back to New York. And Sophie, this is Helena, Marco said. Hello, nice to meet you, Helena responded. Sophie smiled at Helena. She had been looking forward to meeting her ever since Marco came home and said he had met the prettiest young lady. Sophie had to admit Helena was a very pretty girl, and judging by the look on Marco's face, the color of her skin was his least worry. Hello, Helena. I am very pleased to finally meet you. Marco talks about you often, and he was right. You are a very pretty young lady, Sophie said. Thank you. That was very kind of you, Helena said with a smile. You're quite welcome. Now, Marco, you take this salad and you both go and have a seat while I get the rest of the food on the table, Sophie said. After the food was on the table, Sophie went to clean the kitchen. After Helena and Marco finished supper, Sophie cleared the table and was ready to go home. Marco walked her to the horse and buggy. So, what do you think of Helena? He asked. Sophie looked at him and smiled. I think that any woman who can make you smile the way you're smiling now must be special. I just want you to be safe and happy. You know that, Marco, she said. Yes, I know. Thanks for the meal. Everything was delicious, Sophie. Marco hugged Sophie and watched as she drove away. When Marco walked back to the apartment, Helena was taking off her shoes. I hope you don't mind, but my feet are killing me, she said. Not at all. Make yourself comfortable. Let's sit on the davenport and prop your feet up, Marco said. Helena sat down, and Marco put her feet on his lap and began massaging them. Helena closed her eyes. I could get used to this, she said. So I guess a man has never rubbed your feet before, he said. Helena opened her eyes. A man has never rubbed me anywhere, she said as she removed her feet from his lap. I wasn't trying to imply that anyone had, Marco said. Then he picked her feet up and put them back on his lap. I didn't mean it that way. I know you're not a loose girl, he said. You don't know me, Marco. I'm more than just a girl who works at the game house. You think I don't know you? I see you. How beautiful you are. How smart you are. How loving you are. Especially to your sister and brother and the rest of your family. I also see how sweet you are. How strong you are. And how proud you are. You like to pretend you're flying because flying is freedom. As free as a bird. You think I don't know you? I know you. Helen ran the back of her fingers against his cheek. How can you see all of that and never saw how hard it is for me to trust? She asked. Let me be the one you trust, Helena. I promise to never let you down, he replied. Then he kissed her fingers. People think you only want me for your bed wench, she said. Since when you care about what other people think? He asked. You're right. I don't care what other people think. So I'm telling you right now, that's all you want. Marco interrupted her. That's not all I want. I'd be lying if I said being this close to you and touching you don't make me want to ravish you. But I can get pussy anywhere. That's the easiest thing to get. It's all around me. But this, the chemistry we have, the energy we feel between us right now, that's what it's all about. And I don't want a bed wench. I want a woman. Someone I can trust, protect, and love. And I believe I found her. And you will protect me, she asked. Yes, or die trying, he replied. And we will love each other like a real couple, she asked. Marco smiled at Helena's innocence. Yes, sweetheart, just like a real couple. Helena stood up and walked towards the bedroom. Then let's do what real couples do, she said. Marco stood up. Are you sure? He asked. Helena smiled. You better come on before I change my mind, she replied. Marco quickly walked to his bedroom and closed the door behind him. He could tell Helena was nervous. Hell, he was nervous too, but only because it felt like a wish that was finally coming true. Marco picked Helena up and laid her down on the bed. She reached for him. He kissed her passionately and took off her clothes. Then he took off his clothes. He looked at her and said, "You are so beautiful." Marco took his time and stimulated every part of Helena's body. He had never felt skin so soft and smelled so sweet. He even got more excited when he felt her nipples grow inside his mouth. Listening to her heavy breathing made him feel like the luckiest man alive. When he opened her thighs, he felt a sense of urgency to please her as he gently licked, sucked, and savored until she almost reached climax. Then he made love to her. He was careful not to push too hard and hurt her, and he wanted this experience to be a night she would never forget. As he entered inside, he couldn't believe how tight it was, how warm it was, how wet it was. Helena was writhing in ecstasy. She didn't know that making love meant doing so many things. With every thrust he gave her, she gave it right back until they created a rhythm between them. Marco lifted himself up on his hands and saw pure ecstasy on Helena's face. He lifted her legs and kissed her calves before placing them on his shoulders. Then he pushed his way deep inside. Helena called Marco's name until it became a chant. Suddenly, her body felt like it was floating. She grabbed the back of his neck while electric waves flowed through her veins. She managed to catch her breath just long enough to utter, "I never felt like this before." "You never been loved like this before," he replied. Just hearing his voice made her senses react with tremors of orgasmic sensations. Her moans grew louder as her insides started to contract until she felt an explosion deep down inside. Her body shook like an earthquake that tipped the Richter scale to an all-time high. At the same time, Marco yelled her name and pulled her closer before he succumbed to the passion. Marco laid beside Helena and spooned her. "You made me feel so good," she said. "That's what I'm supposed to do," he replied. Helena didn't return home until early the next morning. When she walked in, Teddy was sitting at the table drinking a cup of coffee. "Good morning, brother. Is Helen still here?" Teddy smiled. "Morning, twin. Helen is already downstairs setting up for the breakfast crowd." Helena sighed a breath of relief. "Ooh, thank the Lord. Pour me a cup, bro," she said. "Sure thing, sis," Teddy said as he got up to pour another cup. "Here you go," he said while handing the cup to Helena. Then he sat down and looked at her with a serious expression. "So when was you going to tell me you was dating white boy Marco? I thought we talked about everything, twin," he said. "Everything happened so fast. I wasn't sure how you would react," she said. "You didn't give me a chance to react. I thought we was better than that," he said. "We are. I'm sorry, brother. I just didn't want you to be disappointed in me." "Disappointed in you is something I will never feel. You are my sister, my best friend. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like you dating the son of a white gangster is the smartest thing to do. But I also know that you wouldn't do it unless you liked him. And by the way, you came creeping up the back way with your shoes in your hand after kissing Marco for what felt like forever. I'm guessing you and him are now a thing, he said. Helena smiled. He asked me to be his girl. Judging by the time, I ain't got to ask if you said yes, Teddy said. Helena laughed. So you okay with all this? She asked. Not really. Not yet. It worries me. But by him being Mr. Luigi's son, I know you are protected. Just watch yourself, he said. Helena jumped up and hugged Teddy. Thanks, brother. I will. And no more secrets, I promise. Teddy hugged Helena. No more secrets. Now let me get out of here. I have work to do, he said before walking to the door. When he opened the door, Helena smiled and said, Oh, brother, how long have you been looking out the window waiting for me to come home? Since late last night when Helena told me who you were with. It's what big brothers do, he said with a wink, then walked out.